Good morning, Mom Nation. We are live, we are here, and this is something that I've been super excited about for the last couple of weeks since Diana, my friend Diana, hello, Diana, couples counselor.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm
Awesome.
good.
Well,
How are you?
I'm doing awesome. Welcome. So, Diana and I have been planning this for the last couple of weeks, and it's been something that I've been super excited about. And obviously, Diana is a couples counselor. She specializes in marriage counseling, relationships, things like that. And you're in MOMnation, so you probably have seen post after post after post after post. Often they're anonymous posts, and I totally get why. Just talking about relationship situations and, what would you do type things. And I feel like there's a great need for some help out there. Some like, hey, you know what? First of all, you're not crazy. Yes, things are happening. But here's some different ways that maybe you can try to help alleviate what's going on. Or have you thought of this? Or, communicate in this fashion kind of thing, right? So there's all these different tools and all these different things out there to sort of help people through the day in and day out of relationships. Yeah.
Absolutely. Relationships are not easy.
They're not. And that's actually in our description here. So, everybody, this show is going to be a once a month show. If you have specific questions that you would like for us to go over, please put them in the comment section. Let me pull up the comments so that I can keep an eye on that. I will be keeping an eye on it. So just let us know. As we talk, we're going to talk through some different topics, and let us know if there's something that you really would like for us to touch on. In fact, I put a post in MOMnation Arizona last week, I think it was, or the week before, just saying, hey, if we were to do a show like this, tee hee hee, I knew we were doing it. All right. So if we were to do a show like this, is this something that you'd be interested in? Would you watch? Would you submit questions? And we actually had a ton of feedback on that post and got a bunch of questions and different topic suggestions. So that was pretty exciting. It seems like the people want the information.
Absolutely.
So let's kick off with, I feel like, let's kind of start at the beginning. This is episode 1. Let's talk about the two things, really. So my whole thing is 2-part, and this is probably going to take us the whole hour. But the first thing is would it be appropriate to say, as you're kind of, coming into adulthood, starting to get into romantic relationships, that if your parents didn't have a good relationship, or I guess maybe even if they did, is it appropriate for you to seek out some help? Some like, hey, am I moving in the right direction? Am I communicating appropriately? What's my communication style? What's my love language? There's things that you should know as a young adult moving into getting, kind of starting to get into the romantic side of things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's kind of a multifaceted question, right? Because sometimes we don't know about like our attachment styles or love languages or any of those types of things until we're already in a romantic relationship. So our parents' relationships do have an impact on our future romantic relationships, whether that's good or maybe not so good, but also just our personal experiences. So when we talk about like attachment, we talk about attachment injuries. Those are things that not necessarily were between our parents, but things that we experienced from, people that we trust, like our parents or other adults that are in our lives. So it's kind of multifaceted because it's a little bit of like our own personal experiences. It's a little bit about how relationships have been modeled for us by our parents in our childhoods. And then kind of a little bit of trial and error. You have two different people that are coming into a relationship with different experiences, different attachment styles, all of those things. And then we start to butt heads and we don't always understand why until we do a little bit of digging.
Do you have any specific examples of that? Like, obviously, I know it's all confidential and, we're not going to share any names of your clients or anything like that. But do you have any specific examples of maybe somebody that came in, they were on the younger, side of life, and they were just kind of getting started digging into it. And perhaps they did this and they did that, personal research before getting involved?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of personal research or kind of self-diagnosis that happens, especially now when we have TikTok and Instagram and all these things to be like, oh, maybe I have this or maybe I have that. And most of the time, to be the bearer of bad news, it's not that. Sometimes we like to self-diagnose things when really it's just very situational, very subjective. So a lot of times there's a sense of, I feel like I'm making the same decisions over and over again, or I feel like I'm choosing the same partners. I keep finding people that are, this certain way, or people that, don't really respect my boundaries or treat me respectfully, or those types of things. And what is the common denominator? The common denominator is you. And that's not to be judgmental or to be bad in any way, but that's a really good opportunity to be like, what is your relationship with that? In your past, in your childhood, in your earlier life, like, what is your relationship with people appreciating your boundaries? Are you being comfortable setting those boundaries? Do you feel like you're people pleasing? Do you feel like you walk on eggshells to get people to like you or to not cause conflict with people? And oftentimes that's one of the biggest things in our relationships is we don't want to rock the boat. So we just go with the flow and just do whatever at the sacrifice and of the sake of our own feelings and our own boundaries. So a lot of times, to answer your question, is like, I keep repeating these patterns and I don't understand where it's coming from or why. And then we start looking back and try to find out, what's your relationship, not romantically, but earlier in your life, what is your relationship with seeking out emotional connection with people? Were those needs met? Do you feel like your parents were emotionally available to you? Are there other adults or trusted people in your life that provided you with that emotional attention? Were there things that you feel like you didn't receive or missed out on in your childhood that you were seeking in adulthood in a partner? And that's something that we experience a lot too. So, when you're early in your relationship life, kind of going back and looking at those elemental pieces of your childhood and your attachment and how comfortable you felt and how trusting you felt towards people and what you've been taught about trust is really important in learning about why I have the relationships I do.
Right. And it's not to say that, the way people do things is necessarily like bad, like you're not a bad person,
not.
Right?
Absolutely not.
So what would be an indicator that somebody, and I'm just saying young people because I'm just thinking getting started, like it would have been so cool, Diana, if I had you before I started getting into romantic relationships and could talk this stuff out and could figure out my communication style, could figure out what I'm actually seeking in a partner, could figure out what my love language is. So can we talk through that a bit? Like what does attract us to somebody else? And I'm assuming that again comes from childhood, either positive or negative.
Absolutely. It can be both positive and negative. Sometimes we look for someone, if we've had a really healthy attachment style, we look for people who can role model those types of behaviors that we saw growing up that were healthy, but that also works in the other direction too. So there's this phenomenon called trauma bonding. And sometimes we get into relationships with people who repeat those traumatic behaviors that we've experienced earlier in life because it feels comfortable. It sounds totally weird and totally like, no, I don't want that in my life, but it's an unconscious decision to be drawn towards people that can sometimes repeat those traumatic behaviors for us because it does feel comfortable. There's a lot of things that we hear, especially like going back to, Instagram, TikTok, people that are self-diagnosing and things like that, trying to figure out what goes wrong in their conflict resolution. Why are we fighting about the same things? He doesn't listen to me. She doesn't listen to me. Those types of things. Oh, well, maybe they're a narcissist. Okay, what exactly is a narcissist to you? And what's making you think that they're a narcissist? And we pick that apart a little bit, and it might just be, well, it looks like we're having a hard time validating or hearing what the other person is saying, jumping to the defense, passing the blame around instead of trying to find a resolution. Or, I think that, maybe I'm bipolar. Let's look at exactly what the diagnosis that is required, the symptoms that are required for a diagnosis for bipolar. Oftentimes it's just, mood dysregulation. It could be anxiety, adjustment, depression. It could be all of those things. So when we're trying to find out what are these issues in our relationship that I'm having a hard time navigating through or trying to work through, it's often not labeling it and putting a label on it or putting a name to it. It's what is the process here that happens? So what happens when you say this? And then what is their response? And then what happens? And you're literally picking it apart piece by piece to identify, oh, so this is how you communicate. This is how you communicate. What did you hear her say just now? Because I heard something totally different. right? So we have
Mhm.
these filters already in our minds of what those things sound like based on how we've heard them in the past.
It's so interesting. And how, first of all, I have two questions. This is just how it's going to go, Diana. So the first one is actually, let me write down the other one so I don't forget. But narcissist has been like a buzzword, and that gets thrown around a ton. Can you clear that up for those out there that maybe think they know what it means and they're not quite spot on, or that are self-diagnosing or diagnosing their partners, their friends, things like that?
Absolutely. So narcissistic personality disorder is not as common as we would like to believe. It's actually not that common for like your average person, but the qualities that people identify in their partner are being misconstrued as narcissism. So if you're thinking to yourself like, oh, he's like really selfish, or she doesn't spend enough time with me, she spends too much time with her friends, she's only thinking about herself, he's always playing his games, he's not paying attention to me, he spends his money very frivolously and isn't paying attention to our budget or our finances, or I'm the one that always has to take care of the kids, I'm always the one cooking and cleaning and doing all these things. And like, these are behaviors that are much less often narcissism and more often an expectation that hasn't been met in a relationship, kind of this implicit versus explicit contract of the relationship, right? The rules of the relationship. If we don't make those expectations clear, that's kind of on us, right?
Yeah.
If we don't make those expectations super clear,
Yeah.
then it's on us for not communicating it. The other person's not going to meet you there because they don't know what they are. So then everyone loses. You know what I mean? So instead of jumping to this sounds like narcissism because they're being selfish and they're only thinking about themselves and they don't think about me, and they pick fights with me all the time and all these things, I would really want to parse some of that out and determine, is this really just selfish behaviors or poor conflict resolution or unmet expectations, to try to pick that apart instead of jumping straight to that. Because like I said, it's not very frequent that someone's actually diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder.
Totally agree. And I get like, I don't want to use the word annoyed, but I'm like, really? Like, I just hear it and see it all day, every day, people calling each other that. And I'm like, dude, I don't even think you really know what you're talking about. But thank you for clearing that up. So Absolutely. You brought up something that I feel is, and you tell me, but I feel is probably the most important thing that you can have as a couple, and that's expectations and agreements. And so, like you mentioned, if so-and-so is playing games all day, every day, and the partner is like, well, why aren't you spending time with me? Why are you doing that? Well, maybe that's just their routine. Maybe that's just what they've always done. And if you've never had a conversation about it and said, well, hey, at dinner, I'd really like to have your attention. Can we make an agreement? Like, then you really haven't done your job. You can't expect somebody that is a totally different person, grew up totally differently, raised by totally different people, that is perhaps even a different sex, that is, all these differences. You can't expect them to be inside your brain, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how resentment grows, right? We have these expectations or these needs that aren't being met, and they're just not meeting them because we haven't made them clear. And then resentment grows and grows and grows. And then eventually it just explodes, right? Because we didn't go back and make our expectations explicitly clear. Now, if you made your expectations clear and they're still not being met, then there's some other miss there that has to be like taken a look at, but more often than not, if we don't make that expectation clear, that other person can't read our mind. So they don't know that that's our expectation. So in relationships, there's like two types of contracts, right? So I like to say there's like an implicit contract and there's an explicit contract. So in an implicit contract, it's things that we don't really need to talk about, right? Like we're not going to step outside the relationship. We're not going to cheat on each other. We're not going to hurt each other, whether physically or emotionally. Those are things that like we just don't need to talk about. Like it's just things that we kind of agree upon. The explicit things in the relationship are usually the ones we get stuck on. Do we have somewhere in our explicit contract that I cook 3 days a week, you cook the other days of the week. I pick the kids up from school, you take them to soccer. I sleep in on Saturdays, you sleep in on Sundays. Who's getting up with the baby in the middle of the night? Like, those are the explicit things that we often skip because we think we'll just figure it out along the way. But figuring it out along the way is a really good way to build up some resentment, because then we feel like our needs aren't being met on both sides. And then we start to withdraw instead of coming together and figuring out a solution.
Yeah. And I personally feel like the agreement part is so important. Like, I can say to my husband, hey, I expect X, Y, Z, but if he's not on board with that, like, then it's probably not happening. And I probably need to figure out how to live with that. Right.
Absolutely. And so it needs to come from a place of like a personal need or an emotional need that needs to be met, right? Versus like, you're not doing something right, you need to do this. Anytime you bust out the word you to start that startup, it's not going to go over well, right? Because that's going to elicit a defensive posture. That person's already ready, like, to defend themselves. But if you start it with like an I statement, right? Like, I would really appreciate, or I feel like, or I saw this, whatever that is, you're talking about your own experience and not the other person, even though they're involved in the content of what you're saying. It's coming from your own experience. It becomes much harder to be defensive about that because you're talking about yourself. So anytime you have a need or you're trying to start something up to come to an agreement about something, it's always best to start with yourself rather than the other person if you want to try to navigate around that defensiveness that can occur.
Totally agree. And just because you have an expectation of what a wife or a husband looks like and doesn't mean that they have the same expectation or the same blueprint or, this thinks of it the same. So I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of, hey, come to it from I feel, I think, I want type, instead of you do this, you do that. That's not constructive. They're actually not finding out where the differences are. Like, that's really difficult to then compare, right? If you're going at it that way.
They just feel attacked.
Yeah. So we have a comment here. I'll read it to you. This is from Sabrina May. Thank you, Sabrina, and hello. We have a lot of preconditioned concepts and expectations on what we think a relationship should be going into it. So when it's not exactly like that, it becomes a surprise, and this is where the work comes in. If we can be open and curious about what we can learn from our experiences, then we get to create what we want in the relationship.
Yeah, I love that. That goes along with, expectations and kind of a little bit of values too, right? Like, sometimes we get into relationships and maybe a lot of our values don't 100% align, but there are things that we can compromise on. But if we don't know what the other person's, what their expectations of a role is in the relationships, that's often where we get stuck. So if we grow up thinking like, oh, well, when I was growing up, my mom stayed home and, she took care of the kids and cooked and took care of the house and all of those things. And now you're in a relationship with a woman that works outside of the home and, pays for childcare and those types of things. And, suddenly she's not meeting the expectations of what his picture was of a wife, and vice versa. Like, the man should be the provider. The man should be doing this, should be doing that. A lot of that is social constructs, right? Like, those are things in our society that we have created that are acceptable or not acceptable. And as we are moving forward, we're getting a little better about some of those gender expectations, but they still are very much alive and well. It's very interesting when we see couples come together. A very common complaint I hear is, I don't feel like we're connecting emotionally. I don't feel like he understands me. I don't feel like he understands what I'm saying or hears what I'm saying emotionally. And more often than not, you're right, because he wasn't actually taught how to do that. And in most cases, he's not taught how to express that. Is that every guy ever? Absolutely not. But our society, while again, we're getting better, we reinforce this idea that men are supposed to be strong, right? Man up. Don't be a girl. I'll give you something to cry about. This kind of stuff that's really damaging to boys as they grow up, because then they're taught not to be vulnerable and not to show those more tender, more vulnerable feelings with their partner. And for a woman who was taught basically the complete opposite of that, we figure out that we're button heads. We can't connect emotionally because we've been taught two completely different messages. So part of that is teaching, whichever partner feels like they can't be emotionally vulnerable, that it's okay to, right? So that sounds a lot like validating. I could totally understand you feeling that way. I would feel that way too if I heard that or I saw that or that type of thing, and making those feelings okay. And to go along with that, with the whole validation piece, validation doesn't mean agreeing either.
Right.
So a lot
That's
of times
huge.
that gets confused. I don't have to agree with you to say, I totally hear what you're saying. Like, I would feel really upset if I felt that way too.
Mm-hmm.
That takes zero agreeing, but it allows the other person to know that you're really listening. And to do that means you have to be a little bit vulnerable to open yourself up to other emotions that feel, less fun, less positive.
I love what you said about the roles and how do I want to say it? Because I feel like absolutely everybody is different. There's no like great rule book in the sky that says a wife does this and this and this, and a husband does that and that and this. Like, there just isn't one. Like, we don't have a handbook. So it's really, when you really sit down to think about it, it makes so much sense to, in the beginning of your relationship, when everything is great and nobody's fighting and nobody's figuring out they have differences, right? Because you're in the honeymoon period. I feel like that's the important part. That's the important time to start saying, okay, things are progressing to maybe this next level. And here's here's what I think that looks like. Does it match what you think?
Absolutely. And that's a lot of conversation that we have in like premarital counseling too, right? When people are just getting to that point where they want to either move in together or get married, those types of things. Like, that's a really great time to talk about those things, because you might find some differences that either you can compromise on, or you might find some deal breakers. Like, I'm just totally, I can't do that. I'm not okay with that. And it's better to have that conversation now than a few years from now when it becomes very prevalent and you've had a couple kids and you're more invested, those types of things. It's not to discourage people from getting counseling earlier on. It's just to make sure that your expectations are aligned of what your role should be going into your relationship for the longevity,
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I can't even tell you how many posts I see. And it's been years. And this is a common example. Well, I've been home all day with the kids, and I've been cooking and cleaning, and anybody who stayed home with kids, male, female, or whatever, like, that's a job. Like, that'll make you crazy. But he comes home or she comes home, and the garbage is overflowing, and they walk by it 10 times, you'd think they'd take it out for me. And then the person who has posted this is obviously upset. They're withdrawing. They're maybe doing the whole silent treatment thing because he or she doesn't understand me and doesn't want to help. Like, what a mess that is. And it's probably simply just, hey, would you mind taking out the garbage? It's just been a really busy day, and that would help me out a bunch. Like, that could, like, do you agree? That's probably 99% of the time the solution.
Absolutely. And a lot of times when that does become very like grating, when we're really like feeling the resentment about it, it's been a significant amount of time that's been going on. And now it's like, well, now it's really bothering me. So now I'm going to change the rules. This has been the rule of the relationship, and now I'm going to change it. So it goes back to that soft startup, like, hey, it would be awesome. Like, it would really help me out a lot when you came home from work if you could just grab the trash really quick. Like, something to that effect, where you're changing the rules, but it's about a need. You know what I mean? But anytime you go into a relationship change or something that you're trying to address resentment about, there's always going to be some sort of, oh, that's different. Because that was never a thing before, but now it's a thing. So again, your approach matters. Like, how are we going to go about changing the rules, changing the expectations? But on average, couples wait 6 to 7 years in their relationship before they reach out for help. 6
What?
or 7 years is a super long time, a very long time for resentment to start brewing, conflicts to become, a level 2 conflict to like make or break. And then that's when, okay, well, this is our last ditch effort. We're going to have to go to couples counseling. If we're going to try it and it doesn't work, it's over. And if we could just change our mindset to let's not wait and make it like a last ditch effort, why don't we scale that all the way back towards the beginning and treat it as an investment, right? You buy insurance. You buy insurance for your car, for your house, for whatever. You buy insurance for those things because it's an investment and you want to protect, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't have to wait until things feel like they're imploding before we reach out and try to figure out how can we resolve conflict better? How can I make my needs met? How can I express what my needs are? So taking out the trash, those types of things, those are little things along the way that if we just make our expectations clear, it doesn't turn into an issue 6 or 7 years down the line where they don't help me out with anything around the house. They come home and they go and take a nap and I'm still here taking care of the kids and I never get time to myself, and it just spirals because it's been so long and now we're tired of it and we want to change the rules and we don't know how.
And we haven't spoken up.
Right.
And we haven't shared. 6 to 7 years, that absolutely blows my mind. And I feel like that must put a lot of pressure on the counseling piece of things.
It's tricky, right? Because we want to sort out the good stuff, right? The good stuff versus the problematic stuff, because there's always exceptions. There's always times where the relationship feels really good. It feels really healthy. Everyone's happy. There's always those things. So we want to capitalize on all of those things to help smooth out the other things. So once you get to 6 or 7 years, there's very well some resentment from like 4 or 5 years ago that have happened, right? That we keep arguing about the same thing over and over again. Well, there's a reason for that. The reason that things continue to come up is because they're not resolved. Sure, you talked about them, but did you really resolve them? Chances are, if they keep coming up, one person at least feels like it hasn't been resolved.
Right.
So when people come in, they're like, this has been a problem for a number of years now. These things happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 2 years ago. That's cool. We're going to get to those things. But right now in the present, we need to get to a place where you guys can resolve conflict today, where you guys can communicate clearly today. You can ask for your needs to get met right now. Once we can do that in the present, then we can go back and start reaching for stuff. Okay, so this situation that happened 2 years ago, using the new skills that you have now, let's work through that and work it through to completion so that's resolved. And then we never have to talk about it again. Mm-hmm. But sometimes when couples do come in, it does feel like I have all these issues from the past that have happened and I want to get them fixed now. I want them to apologize now. I want it to get fixed. And we can get to a point where that gets resolved and we can start talking about accountability and changing those behaviors. But we can't do that in the current state. If you guys don't feel like you can talk or resolve conflict right now, there is zero chance that any of those things in the past are going to get resolved until we learn some healthy habits now. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And this, I don't know, this might be a weird question, but when you have two people come together in your sessions, do you often suggest that those individual parties seek counseling for themselves because they may be and highly are likely dealing with a whole bunch of crap? I'm sorry, but I know we've been friends for a while, so you probably know part of my journey. I've been through, lots of therapy and stuff like that. And I honestly feel like, and you correct me if you feel there needs to be further explanation, but I feel like a lot of stuff, like a lot of our junk is from stuff that we learned in childhood, went through in childhood, traumas that we received in childhood, right? Laura and I talk about that a lot. When you see couples come together, is that, if you boil it down, is that most often the problem? And they're just experiencing these things in adulthood as they're trying to, play house with somebody else?
More often than not, yeah, there are things that they could benefit from having individual therapy from, in addition to couples therapy, right? Sometimes I will like prescribe, okay, each of you go to your individual therapy for like 4 to 5 sessions, and then we'll come back together again with some different insights, some different perspectives on like what your role is exactly in this relationship, what you bring to it, where you feel like the other person is falling short. Is there a reason for that? Those types of things. But more often than not, yeah, individual counseling is a really good idea when you're doing couples counseling. That being said, in the beginning of couples counseling, I do like to meet with like each of the members of the couple once, just to kind of like an information dump, like without the other person in the room. You know, maybe there's some things that they're not quite comfortable yet. There's no secrets, but there is value in being able to get all that information and those feelings out in a way where we can help interpret it in a different way, so it doesn't just feel like the blame game.
Mm-hmm.
And then going forward, it's really best practice for each of the partners to get their own individual counselor. So because there could be multiple relationships created there. I've heard over the years where couples have had the same counselor, they see the same counselor for themselves individually. That's not something that I love, only because it does create that multiple relationship, and you don't have so much objectivity anymore.
Right.
So even if it's just one individual of the couple that says, oh, I already have my own individual therapist, can I see you individually and have you as a couples counselor? And the reason I don't do that is because it affects now my relationship with the other partner, because I've spent more time with you now. And so that could make them lose a little bit of trust, thinking like, oh, you guys are just talking about me the whole time, those types of things. So when I do prescribe or suggest that they go to individual counselors, I always refer them out to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I can see that happening. I can see somebody, feeling kind of weird about that and thinking, well, what exactly goes on during your sessions? And then we come back here and, shit gets crazy.
Yeah.
So a couple more things. I told you, it's just going to be just me peppering you. Let's see if we have anybody else. We do have a couple of comments. Sabrina May, so true. Veronica, very true. Glad to hear this. Casey, that's so important. Oh, Casey has a comment. My husband and I did counseling separately for almost a year. It was a lot of our junk. My husband had so many traumas that reflected on me because he didn't know how to deal with it other than turning to anger. Yeah. We did couples therapy for 9 months. It was a lot of work, but it was that or divorce. And our marriage was so worthy of being more. So I love that she made that comment, because that kind of goes into what my next question to you was. And that was, at what point, and this may be different for everybody, but at what point, like, help us to identify that trigger that says, hey, we've got some problems here. We should probably go talk it out with somebody. Like, where's that trigger?
Yeah, I think for everyone, it's awfully subjective. I think it's different for everybody. But if you find yourself having the same conflicts over and over again, like we got to find some way to communicate differently. If you find yourselves in conflict, stonewalling, or the cold shoulder, as you call it, where we just like ignore each other, that's definitely problematic. And that's something that, if it continues, is definitely going to deteriorate the relationship. Any sort of contemptuous language that's happening in conflict, so you always, you never, very absolute type language, is also, it's a way of putting ourselves up here and the other person down here. And that's also super, super toxic to any relationship. And any position where you feel like you're being criticized, or that you're criticizing the other person, again, is kind of contemptuous, puts you on like a pedestal compared to the other person. When you see those things happening in a conflict, that's like, okay, time out. There is an issue with how we're resolving conflict right now, or how we value the other person's feelings or experiences in this. I think we need someone to help us like interpret what we're actually saying and come to a solution in a way where we can talk clearly and be considerate at the same time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like there's this honeymoon period, right? You get together and you're way more focused on the things that you love about each other than the things that you don't. And then as that kind of wears off, then the things that you don't necessarily love about each other kind of start rearing their ugly head. Is that what you see?
Sure. Yeah. There's the limerence phase where just like everything is puppies and rainbows and everything's great. And then things start to come out that you're like, oh, I don't love that so much. But, hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but there's always going to be things about your partner that you're not going to love. But are they things that you can live with because they are not toxic to the relationship? They're not abusive towards you. Are they just little things that, you don't love or that you don't like? You know what I mean? There's a difference. So if you're expecting, oh, we never argue, we never have arguments, we never fight, we never have conflicts, that's an issue, because everyone's going to have conflicts at one time or another. And it's very healthy. It allows you that opportunity to flex those skills and to show that other person how invested you are in them and their feelings by being able to resolve things, all the way through. So the goal is not to never have conflicts ever again. It's to learn those techniques and those tools, those skills to get us all the way through to resolve it. That builds relationships back even stronger when you're able to practice that over and over again. You are teaching your partner consistency. When you teach anyone consistency, it builds trust.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. So here's my last question. We get help for lots of things, right? I go to the dentist, they help me with my teeth. I'm not going to do that myself. I go get an oil change for my car. I'm not going to do that myself. Somebody mows my lawn. Like, I don't do that myself. Why are we so hesitant to get mental health help or relationship help? Like, what does that come from? Why is it just like an admission of failure, or like, what's the problem here?
More often than not, I hear that if I pursue couples counseling, it means we failed. It means that we've given up. It means that we're not good for each other, or there's something wrong with us that we can't figure this out. And it's just not true, right? We're two completely different, complex human beings that are living these very increasingly complex lives. You start from just two people, and then you maybe throw in a couple kids in there, and then some jobs, and then switching jobs, new careers, moving, school, raising kids. Like, you throw in all of this other stuff, all these places for adjustment, and you might wake up one day and be like, oh boy, we have maybe not been paying enough attention to the relationship because we're so busy with all these other things. That's not a failure. That's recognizing, I know how good we are. I know how good we have been. And I know how much I love this person and how invested I am in this relationship. I really want to spend time maintaining that.
Mm-hmm. I love that you brought that all to the surface, because I think that oftentimes, especially as moms, right? Like, oftentimes we don't consider all of those things that we have coming at us constantly. I mean, not only do we have jobs, kids are growing, so we've got to deal with that. We got to parent with this person, right? We have our own needs, our own relationships, our own family that may be doing XYZ, whatever is going on there. We have social media. We have more connection to, whether it be true or not, what's going on in the world that can totally stress you out. There's just bigger, more, faster, bigger, more, faster, it seems constantly. And, I was born in the late 70s, grew up in the 80s. And granted, I was young, so I was looking at it with my child mind, but I feel like life has changed so much just since I was a kid. And that has got to put pressure on the family unit. I mean, it's got to.
Oh, absolutely. Especially from a parenting aspect too, right? Parenting kids now is not the same that it was in the 80s, even the 90s, because we do have social media. We do have different expectations. Our kids are different. Our kids are growing up in a completely different world than we did. So what our own parenting expectations were might not fit anymore. And so we have to come up with new rules, new ways to parent. And that's often a point of contention too, right? Is I feel like we should parent them this way. I feel like we should parent them this way. How about we just compromise and make a conglomerate of both of our beliefs and come up with something different? Because it isn't the same anymore. It's just not.
Mm-hmm. One quick question before we run. And if you have anything else to add, please feel free to do so. And this might actually, you may want this, I don't know, maybe you do, as a topic for another show in the future. But I come from, my parents were divorced when I was 2. And so there was co-parenting there. And do you ever see divorced? You do. So you see like divorced parents that come in to see you that need to get help co-parenting. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yes, that actually makes me really happy when I see those individuals coming in, because it shows me how invested not only are they in like the care of their kids and raising their kids, but they're also, to an extent, they're invested in the other person as a parent, right? That person is always going to be in your life. And just as much as you care about your kids' well-being, that parent has to be healthy, and that parent has to be in a good co-parenting situation with you in order for those kids to reap the benefits of it. So to be able to come together and set aside the fact that romantically we are not good together, but we are co-parents now. This is a much greater calling right now that we have to raise these kids and show them what it can be. Show them what it can be to have 2 divorced parents who love them, that care for them, that can attend each other's birthday parties and, you know, those types of things, to show them that being divorced doesn't always mean they never communicate or that they fight or any of those things. It can be so much more. You can teach them so much more than maybe what their friends have experienced or what we've experienced, you know, growing up with divorced parents. So yeah, I think it's great when people do that and they invest the time to figure that out for, you know, for the greater good.
Yeah, that actually makes me so happy that it's a thing and people actually do that. That makes me so happy. So necessary, I feel like. Because really at the end of the day, I mean, I don't know about all y'all out there, but at the end of the day, my kid is it. He's like the be all end all. He's the most important thing. And, you know, it's so important for me to do the very best I can, access the resources that I have access to in order to give it my best shot. I mean, I don't know how else to say, you know, I mean, he is the absolute apple of my eye. And I certainly don't want to pass along things. That's a big deal, right? Like I certainly don't want to pass along things to him that, you know, didn't serve me in my lifetime, some things that I picked up along the way. And so it's definitely important for me to be the best parent I can be. Well, Diana, this was an amazing first episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
Heck yeah. I'm looking forward to it next month. Everybody, we will be here again next month. Just take a peek at the events calendar, and that way you'll know the dates in another couple of weeks. So we'll be back in April talking about another thing. Diana and I will have to figure out what that is, but that's okay. We will. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, Diana, what's the best way?
So you can go onto my website. It's dianaeiseltherapy.com. Right at the top there, you can actually schedule a free consult. So you can get a free 15-minute consultation. It takes you to a calendar where you can pick your day and time of your choice. And then we can chat a little bit and see if it's a good fit. And then we can go from there.
Sweet. I love it. All right. We'll see you next month.
Bye.
Bye.